It's my pleasure today to welcome back to the series Richard Giarusso and Andrew Jonathan Welch. This is a collaboration we've had for a number of years, and the duo always comes up with a fantastic program of challenging music, but music and the way that it's structured, there are always these deep, resonant connections between the pieces on the program. Today, they prepared for you today an incredible recital of art song featuring the music of Charles Ives, Hans Eisler, Samuel Barber, and Maurice Ravel. On the surface, these different composers may not seem to have anything in common, but listen carefully, listen closely. This is a deeply nuanced and carefully thought out program. So it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Friday Music Concert Series Richard Giarusso and Andrew Jonathan Welch.
Good afternoon and welcome. Andrew and I were on this stage together almost exactly 2 years ago to the day. I think it was this same weekend in October. Little did we know what the ensuing months had in hold for all of us, but it goes without saying that we are truly delighted to be back. We would be happy to be back at any time, but especially under these circumstances. So just a couple things about the program. You have a program essay which you can take a look at some time. But as Professor Daldana has said, the composers on today's program at first glance may appear to be somewhat of a motley bunch. The broader theme that runs through the program is the idea of American song construed quite creatively. From the vantage point of these four composers, two of them native-born American composers, and two distinguished European composers who took up residency in the United States at different times. Hans Eisler, for quite an extended period of time in the late 1930s and early 1940s, when he was living in Southern California, having fled the Third Reich. And Maurice Ravel, who towards the end of his very distinguished career made a tour of the United States in 1928. The way that this program came together, we initially had the idea, Andrew and I have been talking for some time about doing some Ives. So we started with Ives, and other things started to sort of grow around it. And as often happens in the rehearsal process, we had a lot of stuff that was sort of in the hopper being considered, and then it sort of sifted down to the content that we have today. And as we sat more and more with this repertoire, we discovered that there are some very powerful themes that run through all of this music. The most powerful, of course, is the idea of memory and how we engage with memory, how we live with memories in the present, how memories inform the way that we interact in the present. Both Ives and Eisler deal in very powerful ways with memory. Ives, who is really meditating a lot upon stories of his childhood, the music of his childhood. You'll hear these musical memories filter in and out of the textures. For Eisler, writing these books from the Hollywood songbook in Los Angeles in the early 1940s, he is, of course, spending a lot of time thinking about the homeland that he left, the homeland in which it became impossible for him to stay, the homeland in which he was made to feel like a foreigner. Here in the United States, in Southern California, he's sought refuge, but also finds himself in this context, in a very foreign setting. So in these songs, many of them based upon poetry of his friend and fellow exile Bertolt Brecht, he's engaging very strongly with also these ideas of memory, home, nostalgia, longing, and dreams. So the program is arranged in 4 sets, and we'd invite you to hold your applause until the end of each set. So we'll continue now with a sequence of songs of Eisler and Ives, and we'll speak a little bit before our next set, and then we'll continue on from there.
Aus der Heimat hinter dem Blitzenrot, da kommen die Wolken her. Aber Vater und Mutter sind lange tot, es kennt mich doch niemand mehr. Es kennt mich doch niemand mehr. Die Vaterstadt, wie find ich sie doch, folgend in Bombenschwärmen komm ich nach Haus. Wo liegt sie mir? Wo liegt sie mir? Dort, wo die ungeheuren Gebirge vom Rauch stehen, das in der Freuden dort ist sie. Die Vaterstadt, sie empfängt sie nicht wohl, vor mir kommen die unbetödliche Sterne, melden euch meine Rückkehr.
thank you so very much. As Richard said, it's a real pleasure to be back at Georgetown and playing on this series. And truly there are a number of reasons that it's a pleasure, and one of which is, of course, Professor Anthony Del Donna almost always says yes to whatever program we propose. This one was a lot of fun to put together, as Richard said, primarily motivated by some pieces that we had talked about through the years, the number one of which was a set of Ives pieces. Next year, 2022, will mark the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ives' 114 songs. So in some ways, this recital is a bit of a pre-party for that seminal volume of American art song. In other ways, it is about exploring the different relationships between several canonic 20th century composers, one of whom, Maurice Ravel, might seem to be a bit of an outlier on this program. Maurice Ravel lived from 1875 to 1937, but as always, dates don't tell you the whole story. Ravel's fame rose in the first decade of the 20th century, primarily through scandal when he was multiple times denied the top composition prize for young composers in Paris, Prix de Rome. Out of that scandal and out of increasing public admiration for Ravel's work, his celebrity was vaulted up to alongside Claude Debussy, the primary French composer of that period. Most of Ravel's seminal works are composed during these first 14 years of the 20th century. For a number of reasons, his output slows considerably during the First World War and then significantly thereafter. His output also changes, and so the two songs that we pulled for you today by Maurice Ravel are just two of the 5 songs that he wrote throughout the entire 1920s. And beyond that, he only wrote 3 more as part of set. So these are some of the last works for voice and piano that Ravel writes. And for me, they reveal sort of stunning, unexpected trends in his compositional language that, had he not suffered from early onset dementia, had the medical procedures that were attempted to bring him into good health have survived, simply begs to be asked the question, what could he have done? You're going to hear a composer who increasingly is obsessed with the interplay between different sonorities, different styles. Perhaps a man who is finally feeling the younger generation coming up behind him, a composer who has seen firsthand the horrors of World War I, or simply an endlessly curious composer who, faced with new ideas, begins integrating them into his musical language. In these ways, Ravel reminds me of Charles Ives, a composer who does not eschew the music that's around him, but finds ways to borrow it, finds ways to quote it, to manipulate it, and create something that is greater than the sum of its original parts. This set also explores themes of childhood, themes that are, of course, shattered at the end with one of the most famous and important of all Ives songs, Tom Sails Away.
Was
So this next set will juxtapose a series of songs of Eisler with a few more pieces of Ives. The themes in this set are focused heavily upon the idea of exile and the thoughts of home, complex and contradictory though they may be, that are forged in such a context. When Eisler settled in Southern California in 1942, he was, of course, joining an extraordinary emigre community of German intellectuals who had all sought refuge in and around Los Angeles in the late 30s and early 40s. Among them, musicians Arnold Schoenberg, Otto Klemperer, Bruno Walter, the philosopher Theodor Adorno, the writers Franz Werfel and Alfred Döblin. The list goes on and on. Thomas Mann also. It just so happened that I've been reading recently this new novel by the Irish novelist Callum Tobin called The Magician, which is a sort of fictional account of the life of Thomas Mann and his family. And just this morning, as sometimes happens, I came across this description of the German exile experience in Southern California, filtered here through the vantage point of Thomas Mann, as imagined by Callum Tobin, but I think really applicable, especially in the first song that you'll hear, Die Landschaft des Exils, the landscape of exile. Just read this to you. Thomas smiled at the thought that the sweet Californian skies, the beautiful soft mornings when he could breakfast in the garden, the abundance, the blameless beauty, had not conspired to alter his mind. Rather, the gray skies, the rainy springs, the long winters, the raked light on the Isar River, or the recalcitrant weather of Lübeck had forged a sensibility so solid that it could not be transformed or even affected by this extended spell in paradise. Thus, his novel, then taking shape, would show no sign that he had ever been away from Germany. The austerity and I think the palpable sense of nostalgia that you'll hear in these Eisler songs especially captures some sense of this contradictory and very dynamic experience. So, on another set of songs of Hans Eisler and Charles Ives.
Aus der Chine
So before we move on to our last set, there's a turn of phrase that Eisler borrows from Herdevin. Richard and I actually haven't talked about this, but it's one of my favorite little snippets of the program. In a rough translation, Herdevin says, "I would like to compose you an artless song, kunstloses Lied." It's interesting that Eisler employed it because both Eisler and I share something else in common. They didn't know the fate of their songs. So I mentioned earlier that 114 Songs celebrates its 100th anniversary next year. Something that we didn't discuss is that Ives couldn't get the volume published. He started out by mailing it to scores of prominent musicians, intellectuals, and publishers, very few of whom even bothered to write him back. Eisler, likewise, never sought to get the Hollywood Liederbuch published. The fact that we have it all collected and all together today is of great boon, but Eisler was largely preoccupied with other more commercially successful projects during his time in Los Angeles. These would have been considerations that Samuel Barber never faced. Barber was a superstar musician from his very earliest emergence onto the scene. When he was admitted at the Curtis Institute at a very young age, he was the first person admitted for 3 different concentrations: composition, piano, fabulous pianist, and also voice. He possessed a beautiful baritone voice. So in that sense, could have done this last set all by himself. Remarkable voice in American composition, and Barber found success in virtually every major form of the Western art music tradition: concerto, chamber music, solo music, choral music. His first opera, Vanessa, was fairly successful, but when the Metropolitan Opera opened their new opera house, they commissioned Barber, who was unquestionably the leading American composer, to write an opera for that occasion. And his opera, Antony and Cleopatra, was not just a notorious flop. It was really quite the carnage. The critics piled on top of him and wondered if all of Barber's best days were behind him. Retrospectively, we look back at this and recognize that many of these were writers and musicians perhaps seeking to settle scores or motivated on by one another. But Barber did not take this particularly well, and the last chapter of his life is one that mixes small triumphs with a great and abiding sadness. Those don't necessarily creep their way into these songs, though, the last songs that Barber wrote, and we'll hear his incredible sense of humor in the middle song. As I said, these are the last songs that Barber wrote, closing a distinguished career in writing American art song. We hope that you enjoyed these 3 songs from the Opus 45.
Suddenly they lie off like cows, looking with indifference at the white flowers of the audience, at the majestic blinking of the
Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure to present this program for you. We recognize this is something of a weighty program, so we wanted to leave you a beautiful program, but weighty. We wanted to leave you something that fits with our theme in very beautiful ways, but will send you off, we hope, with a slight less weight upon your shoulders. The American composer Mark Blitzstein had similar political sympathies to Hans Eisler. That's the first way we'll bring him into this program. In 1946, he wrote a piece called The Airborne Symphony, in which he reflected on his own service in the U.S. Air Force during the Second World War. One of the most beautiful lyrical moments of that piece is a short song that he writes called The Ballad of the Bombardier, in which a 19-year-old soldier about to go into a dogfight is sitting overseas in Europe writing a letter home to his girlfriend, whose name is Emily. It's a special favorite of mine, so I'll admit it's a bit of an indulgence to add to this program. Andrew was good enough to humor me. But it also ties in these themes of home, longing for home, and of course this extraordinary sense of tumult that caused such widespread sense of displacement, realized at so many levels, incalculable number of levels, at the mid-century. So enjoy this last little offering from Mark Blitzstein of the Ballad of the Bombardier.
That night, a white-faced 19